demonstration of our bonsai open. We have, for the first time, we're trying to run a bit of a concurrent demonstration. So we've got Evan, who will be working on this juniper cascade, and we've got Hugh, who will be working on this Kunzea. Hugh's demonstration will be going in the morning session and the afternoon session. Evan, we're putting him under time pressure because he's only got 2 hours. So there'll be a break in the middle of the day. So we'll go from 10 till 12 with Evan. Hugh will go from 10 till 12, and then we'll be back from 1:30 till 3:30. We'll auction this tree at midday, and then we'll put this tree up for auction at 3:30. And tomorrow we will have another 2 demonstrations. We won't be doing concurrent. We'll have a morning and an afternoon demonstration, but we'll have Sean and Michael Wood in the morning. In the afternoon. No, hang on. That's this afternoon. Sean and Michael Wood this afternoon on at the same time as Hugh, and then tomorrow morning we've got Magumi Bennett, and then we've got Evan again. Yeah. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a bio on these 2 guys. No doubt many of you are familiar with these guys, but they might have provided me with nice bios, so I better read them. So Evan's been practicing bonsai since 2012, and quickly decided after that to dedicate himself to the art form. He's spent extensive time studying in Japan under the tutelage of Koji Hiramatsu and Masahiro Sasaki, who are both regarded as some of the top shogun bonsai artists in Japan. For those who don't know, shogun are the small bonsai. Collectively, he studied in Japan for 11 months on 3 different trips between 2015 and 2019. He's also had the opportunity to participate in several overseas exhibits, including the Gutha 10 and the Taikan 10, where bonsai, which was styled by Evan, were sold. During his time with Koji Hiramatsu, that was in a pine production area of Takamatsu, and it allowed him to experience and study the various growing techniques used during the development of pine bonsai. He's got a tertiary background in horticultural sciences, giving him an extensive knowledge of all aspects of plant and soil science, along with fundamental knowledge in the fields of mycology, entomology, organic chemistry, and biology. He's an active member of the Sydney Bonsai community and has been involved with the European Bonsai Society and the School of Bonsai. He's been a teacher for the School of Bonsai for several years, along with currently serving as their master staff. Evan currently works as a product development horticulturalist for Yates, where he is responsible for developing new plant fertilizers and garden pest products for the home garden market. He also undertakes occasional bonsai styling work for a few select clients. Was there anything I missed?
I think that was about it.
Pretty good? Yeah, considering you wrote it. Alright, Hugh, so no doubt many of you guys know these guys, but Hugh Grant has been doing bonsai since the age of 11. He was immediately drawn to the art form after seeing a segment on television. Naturally, he got his first tree soon afterwards. As a teenager, Hugh spent much of his time learning to collect trees to make bonsai. The early fascination and what would later be described as an empathy for the aesthetic beauty of trees led to the discovery of a skill set that would later become an intuitive backbone of his knowledge and creativity in his practice. Studying fine arts at the University of Newcastle from 2013 to 16, Hugh began to understand bonsai as more than an interest, taking on the role of a lifestyle. The artistic focus of his bachelor's degree allowed him to dive into the creative exploration needed to develop a language around the visual arts that is carried into his practice today. In 2016, Hugh furthered his bonsai studies through an internship with the renowned bonsai professional Ryan Hugh of Bonsai Mariah in Oregon in the States. Ryan's teaching and ongoing mentorship led to Hugh developing an understanding of bonsai as interpreted in the Western world. While it's traditionally an ancient practice of the Eastern world, modernity has witnessed an expansion of the art form as a practice adapted and applied to native species and languages. Therefore, Hugh's emphasis on native Australian bonsai comes from interpreting the natural world as he has always known it, yet through the lens of an ancient art form. Hugh has been pursuing bonsai as a profession in Australia since 2016. He now runs Tree Makers Bonsai Studio, a garden, bonsai gallery and school. He's currently working on establishing this facility as a world-class establishment representative of Australia as a country ecosystem for bonsai culture. So there you go, that's these 2 fine gentlemen. So, we've never done this before, so you guys have to nut it out how it works with the both of you working together and talking about the trees. And I'll throw it over to the 2 of you guys. You play your lights on?
Yeah, I think
I Hi guys. There we are. It's all on? Yeah, it's always weird. You can never hear yourself. Like you guys can hear it. Yeah, this will be a really fun demonstration. It's something I always see any show I've been to overseas. There's usually many demonstrators on stage, you know, if not 3, 4 or 5 people. It gives a lot of visual interest for you guys. And it gives us a lot of time to actually just get stuck into work while the other is maybe more entertaining, right? So I guess the way we'll work it is we'll just sort of to and fro between discussing our scopes of work and
We can grab Rob as a mediator if we both want to chat at the same time. So.
Yeah, totally.
Do you want to make a start on talking about your tree first, and then?
I'll make a start on this, and then I'll hand it over to Evan. So a little history on this tree. So the reason I am spending all day on this is because it's kind of a complex piece of work, and I wanted to be able to show you guys what it looks like to work on a tree like this in real time. Because to do a piece of work on a tree like this over 2 hours I would reserve myself maybe just to talk about design, maybe show you guys how to prune, but I wouldn't go too far than that. But with the whole day ahead of us, I'll be able to sort of work through this and massage the design exactly as I would if I was working in my studio at home. I had a guy actually outside asking me, you know, like, is it good to be doing this kind of work during a demonstration at this sort of time of year? And I'd say, yeah, exactly. If I were at home this weekend rather than here, I probably would be wiring this because it's ready, right? It's ready for that scope of work. So I'm just going to sort of roll through this. I'll explain some of my decisions. It's going to be a pretty wire-heavy session, so don't feel like you have to watch me the whole time. But also, if you guys want to get up and close and look at this, please do come and get close and personal and look at the work. I would say with Evan too, you know, don't be afraid to get close and look. It's a nice small room which helps. But so this is a Kunzea. It's got a fun history to it. I collected it very early on in the days when I started collecting Kunzea, around sort of 2016, 17. What was this one before that? Let's just call it that. It might have been a few years before that, but I can't quite remember anymore. But it's been out of the ground a while. And so I sold it as raw material probably about 2 years post-collection to a guy named Matt Hudson down in Melbourne. It would have been 16, 17 I collected it, because he bought it in 2019. And then he worked on it at a workshop with Ryan Neal, so my mentor. And they created a really interesting design for it. Matt then took it back to his studio, and the following year he repotted it at a slightly different angle to what they styled it with Ryan, and then subsequently he kind of reformed the tree into roughly kind of the orientation that you see on the stone slab now. He then had to move back to New Zealand around 2021 maybe. He's originally from New Zealand, and so he called me up and said, like, you know, this tree's been through some really fun times. It's sort of evolved a lot. Like, I'd like you to have it back, you know. So I acquired the tree back. And then about a year after that, I planted it on the stone slab, tweaked the angle slightly again, and adjusted a few of the trunk lines. The trunk lines are actually a lot closer together. All of these were further into the center. So I spent the last kind of couple of years using some guy wires to actually change the trunk shapes and move them and open them up and just shift their positions and make them more three-dimensional. A bit of pruning, a bit of management, but the tree is it's not raw material because it's had work done to it that has evolved the form, but we're almost back to an initial styling moment within the tree's history and design. So with all of that work that's happened, the history that it's had, today I want to sort of just bump it up again and start to get to a place where maybe we can start to refine this tree to a more show-ready tree over the next few years. So I'll talk about that as the day goes on. So I'm going to sort of get to know the tree a bit, look around it, figure out, make some preliminary prunes, start cleaning the foliage, and then after which I'll discuss the use of more design ideas and intentions. So I'll hand it off to Evan.
Yeah, so my tree, obviously a juniper, quite typical stock that you find in a lot of bonsai nurseries that's had some decisions made in terms of the trunk has been styled at some point early on. A lot of it's been left to grow long, to obviously put a lot of vigor into the tree and to thicken it up. And unlike Hugh's tree, I don't know the story behind this one. I also sent a few photos a few months ago, and then saw it for the first time in the flesh yesterday. And really, with the time constraint we've got this morning, I won't be able to do the sort of fine refinement work like Hugh's going to do for his tree. This will be more of a raw first styling. So the objective today is to obviously reduce a lot of foliage, start to form the foundations of what will be hopefully be a good tree in future, and then to obviously get it on the start of its journey. So there's still many years of refinement before I would even consider putting this into a bonsai pot. But for today's demo, it's all about cutting back, getting it ready for that next stage, and hopefully trying to also put in a bit of a good show for you guys. So yeah, there'll be a lot of dramatic cutting for my tree at least to begin with. So I'll talk through design in terms of everything about this tree. And with most trees that are grown, a lot of the styling is locked in, usually from day 1 or 2 of when that seedling was wired up. All of that is really difficult to change, obviously. So because of that, it means this tree just lends itself to that cascade style immediately when I see it. We do have the choice where I could cut off this large cascading branch, but for me, part of the character of this tree and the joy of this tree is where that branch comes from is very low, which is ideal for a good-looking full cascade. So what we'll do is aim to work within the conventions of the stock that we've got, and look to basically optimize that design. How can we make the best full cascade possible with this tree? So just to start off, I might just cut a few big branches off quite quickly, just so we can get a clearer idea and understanding of what we're dealing with inside the tree. So for starters, I'm going to take off some of these branches on the front off, particularly this big heavy one. That's a goner. There's one on the back here, which for the height of the trunk of this tree, and the fact that we've got all this large foliage up top, there really isn't a need to have quite a thick branch that low, particularly in the back of the tree. So this one we're just going to cut off completely and turn into a gin, and not a terribly long gin either. It's my preference. That one's gone. Okay, so even with just those 2 elements removed, I'm starting to get a clearer picture of what the rest of this trunk looks like. So one thing at the moment is we've got this really nice branch sort of trunk section up here. It has a lot of interesting movement and character. The only issue, if we have this current angle in the tree, all of that's really lost when we view the tree from the front. So one of the most common things I tend to do when I first work on a tree is do 2 things, sort of tilt it left and right to sort of see what it looks like at these different angles. But people often forget to tilt it back and forward as well to see how we can change maybe how we're seeing the trunk within the tree. So one of the things I'm going to try and do is tilt it back quite dramatically to actually turn this section here into the continuation of the trunk and the apex. What that does is actually opens up a lot of the front. Okay, it's very difficult to see with this in the way, so I'll probably cut this off a bit later. But it opens up this base area here to make it visually more appealing in terms of you can actually see a much wider base. But we also get this very interesting back and forth movement in the trunk. So the trunk, if we tilt it up at that angle, sweeps back and then has this amazing movement back up to the front. So yeah, that's the first thing I'm looking for, is how to pull out the most interest from that trunk. And usually the easiest, and I've seen this done a dozen times, I've seen it done particularly when my teacher from Japan comes here, just tilting a tree back or tilting a tree forward makes a world of difference. So that's that bit done. I'll tilt the tree back and then start pruning off some of these larger branches down low. So this is the angle I'm looking for. So it raises it up enough where we can keep this section and work around it, potentially wire some of these branches down. But it doesn't come back, tilt it back too far back that we lose the character in this cascading branch. If anything, it actually improves it, the fact that that cascading branch, instead of coming pretty much straight down and across, now at this new angle it sort of comes back and then forward a bit as well, putting a bit of interest in there. So I might get my assistant to come up on the stage and I'll introduce him as well. So my assistant today is my good friend Garwin, who's another teacher with me at the School of Bonsai. Yeah, we've been doing bonsai quite closely for the last, 3 years now. Yeah, so Fortunately, Garwin's also one of my students, but he also understands how I style, so he's probably the best person to assist me with what we're doing today. So the next stage is I want to cut off one or two of these long cascading bits. So at the moment, spin this round, you can see we've just got a mass of different trunks and they're all sort of crisscrossing each other. It's really just visually too busy. I want to simplify that, particularly in my mind when you're dealing with a cascading trunk. It's less a trunk and more of an exaggerated first branch, in my opinion. A good cascade should still have an upward moving apex and should have some branch structure like a traditional bonsai does up here. And this section, really is just a very exaggerated first branch that happens to go below the pot line. But at the moment, visually, it's too cluttered, so I'm going to do some more big cuts. Okay, and the first one I want to do is actually just get rid of this big one up here. So. And I don't want to turn this into a gin either. Even if I leave it as a gin, that's still more visual mass or clutter that's there. So removing that, instantly you can see there the focus is more on, okay, very difficult to see from where you are, I'll cut this pot soon. But more focus is on the big cascading trunk there. So that's the first one to go. And then this second trunk here, I'm a bit on the fence still about whether I'll keep it or not. So at the moment, with where we stand, if I were to remove this, you lose a lot of foliage from this upper section here, because this has been shading the upper portion of this other trunk, but because of that, we actually have quite a significant lack of branching in this section. So while it does look a bit funny, it's probably more advantageous if I actually keep this for now. We work with styling with this branch and try and incorporate it into the design. Otherwise, we'll get a lot of visual space here, which isn't, I don't want space, I want sort of a nice cascade that flows down with the foliage pads. So by keeping this, hopefully that will aim to fill that gap there. Okay, you want to, I'll maybe throw back to Hugh if you want to talk about what you're currently doing.
Yeah, sure. So I'm just pruning, sort of preparing the growth. So you can see I'm plucking off lots of really little bits of salt and pepper. And just sort of taking out overly long branching. Now, how do I know if it's overly long? I'm kind of, because this tree has already had a lot of structural preparation, what you're not seeing in this work today is all of the, one or two prunes every now and again that have gone into building the structure over time from a preparatory perspective. So what I'm doing today is just looking at those lines that have been pruned in and kind of selecting and thinning them down to the best ones, the ones that kind of move, that alternate with other branches. So the design kind of all fits together nicely. I'm taking out anything that's overly coarse, where the branch line doesn't change direction for very long. I'm just bringing it back down to smaller internal structures. And this is all relative to the size, right? Because obviously, this isn't necessarily a small branch when I say down to smaller structures, but relative to the entire tree, it's smaller and in scale more so. Taking out some sort of weaker lines, I'll convert these over into deadwood. Some of these branches I've just taken off. Some of them had just really weak little branching on them that, I've tried to keep momentum in and keep the health up in, but as you can see, this tree has sort of quite an equality of strength across it. So I'm going through and filtering out anything that just doesn't have that quality of strength. When you have so many branches, sometimes it's not that worthwhile to try and keep something that's really, it might be an interesting branch line, but maybe it's better off just as an interesting piece of deadwood. Right? And as you can see, this tree has the history of creating deadwood, right? All of this has been created over time. I don't think this tree had, maybe this piece, because this piece has some very, very deep, and when you guys get to come up and look at this tree in detail, do come and look at this piece of deadwood, because it does sort of show the age of the tree. There's on this little gin here, there's a tiny hollow in the actual branch itself, right? So incredibly detailed tree when you get close up and start to look at it. But you can see even just from when we started, I've probably taken off 5-10% of the foliage mass already. And you can see that the structure looks a little bit more open than when it started. So that's sort of what I'm looking for. So my next job is now to go through and take all of these lines that I would call structural lines. So anything that comes off of our trunk line and comes off of whatever is the dominant trunk line on all of our trunks. Any of those branches that we call primary or structural. I'm going to go through and start to lay those out with wire, fill space, and then from there it will just be detailing the tree out pretty extensively. So there's a little bit of structural work to do. It's going to be the bulk of the work in terms of thought and consideration. And then once we detail wire, it will be pretty easy going, although much longer scope of work, right? So let's start with it. So in terms of the choice of viewing angle, again, because I've been premeditating this work for a few years, prior to now, I've come up with some ideas, as you'd imagine. But how I've planted it on the slab, how I've moved the trunk lines has been kind of aiming for somewhere about here being my viewing angle, right? And it looks pretty obvious because it has been prepared as such, right? Now we should make sure we explore any other angles that are intriguing, because just because it's been premeditated and thought about, sometimes you can miss the mark, right, when you do that, right? Especially once you're going to think about styling a tree, other ideas start to well up to the surface. But tell me, from that viewing angle, I'll just swing it across the crowd now, right, sort of looking in here. Basically where you see the three main trunk lines sort of all have their own sort of space is what we're looking for there. Do you guys see any other angles if I spin the tree all the way around that intrigue you or you think are interesting? Does anyone have any other ideas? Yeah?
Can you rotate it back to me then?
This way?
Yeah.
About there?
So what's pointing at me now is art, and you've got fluid vision of all of the trunks.
Yeah, let's have a look. Let me have a look. Yeah. So it's almost the exact opposite side to the side that I'm proposing, which is super common, right? The second best front or the best front that you haven't noticed often is just the direct other side of the tree, right? The front back flip, right? Yeah, and this works really, really nicely. You do get really, really good distribution of the trunk lines. There's one key factor, because I have considered this side a lot, there's one key factor that draws me away from it. And the main factor is the relationship of the three trunks, right? Notice how from this side, it really, really accentuates the fact that it appears to be much smaller here than here. And that's really the one draw away for me for using that side. It creates a sense of a lack of integrity, let's say, right? A lack of sort of power, right?
And the root comes out the bottom there.
Which one?
The root comes out the bottom.
This one?
Yeah, so you wouldn't have that at the front.
Oh, I wouldn't base it on this root structure. I mean, this is sort of journeying towards being a very, very interesting feature. I don't know if anyone can see. Notice how there's a little curl on the top here. Right? So often with collected trees, you'll have roots that are generally, structural roots especially, that are overly too long for the tree. Now, a little bit of information on Kunzea. Kunzea function very similarly to a juniper. In fact, it's quite interesting that we're both working on a juniper and a Kunzea at the same time, because we're almost looking at similar approaches but different worlds, right? Different species, different mentalities, different nationalities of the trees even, right? But the vascular functionality of a Kunzea is very, very similar to an old juniper, in that the vascular system, I call it linear vascular. So certain veins are responsible for certain branches, which are responsible for certain roots. So there's very distinct, direct pipelines that feed back and forth. Unlike, say, maybe a trident maple being probably the greatest example, I would call it horizontally vascular. Right? That's why they callus almost anywhere you make a cut, that'll heal it over. And the reason being is because they can patch up and move resources around the tree quite freely, right? Where Kunzea, especially when they're older, younger trees are a little bit more flexible, but older trees especially, if I cut this trunk off, this whole side of the vascular system and this root will turn into deadwood, right? Because this root doesn't feed this branch, right? So you'll notice on this root, there's a little root that curls up over the top here. And this is my attempt, and I can't recall if I put that curl in that root or if it was already there. You know, it's hard to remember nowadays, but I would imagine it was already like that, because Kunzea will very often have fine roots that kind of disperse around their structural roots quite heavily. And when you have just one tiny little root dropping into the container, and you need to reduce what would be a really elongated, difficult to use root to put it in the right pot, sometimes we can maintain the integrity and the life of that root by simply dropping the fine part back into the container. And this becomes then over time a feature. So I'm waiting for this to recede more because it's swelling on the top, it's not swelling on the bottom. So it's creating its own vascular structure, right? Much like a shari line. There is a shari line or deadwood line forming through this root. So this will become a snag of deadwood with a little live vein root running across the top. So over time, it will become quite endearing, right, to the tree, right? So in a way, this will become an interesting feature in the design. Definitely because of how much it's swollen, the tree is definitely using it. So I'd never discard that root. And that would be the other option, is if there's a root dropping off the bottom of this root, you could eventually turn this into deadwood and break it back, something along those lines. With Kunzea, never do on a large old structure, never just cut the branch flush, because they don't heal super well. Again, like a juniper, I'd never go through and do a concave flush cut on an older juniper. Younger is a little bit of a different story. Especially if you're growing the structures out, but older trees that you're starting to design or refine, deadwood always on junipers and Kunzea, because if you just do a flush cut, you'll just have a flush cut sitting there forever, right? So in a way, depending on the species that you work with, you know, whether you like deadwood or not, I think if you're going to work with Kunzea and juniper, you kind of have to work with deadwood, because that is the methodology to have the tree have the best aesthetics, let's say, over time. So that's, but going back to the front, I still feel like the original choice, unless someone's got any other options for me to consider, I do still feel like the original intention that I've come in with today works. It's good engagement, it really engages the viewer, so there's lots of sort of trees doing this, especially if we look at it from the side. So it gives us lots of scope to play with depth. But what the primary reason I've chosen this side is because you have a really powerful, relative to the other sides of the tree, a powerful relationship of base into those three trunks, right? You notice that it's at its widest, right? And it feels like it really occupies that space quite well, right? It shows off this really interesting piece of deadwood feature too, which is fun. I think Kunzea are all about sleekness, a little bit of sexiness, but a little bit of ruggedness as well, right? They're quite a rugged tree. So I think anytime you can show off some of those more angular, rugged features, the better. So anyone got any other ideas that you see, or shall we lock it in? Shall we flip it upside down, cascade it?
So I've had a couple of thoughts. Have you considered either one of these as like a front to it, or would you never have the trunk coming towards you?
Oh, so are you saying consider somewhere around here?
Somewhere in here.
Oh, like more towards one of these two sides of that side?
So you've currently got it facing this way, right?
Yeah, I think about where it's facing right now, yeah.
My thought would have been
Yeah. So that again, it seems like the obvious choice, right?
You get a lot of movement in that direction. If you
do get a lot.
some of this stuff, you get
Yeah.
a background with the other one behind it.
Yeah, I think
you get
if
more of the deadwood here and
yeah.
in the back.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you were to say maybe eliminate, which is definitely an option. Imagine eliminating this major apical piece up here. You expose the movement of that line. Because from this proposed side, what you notice is, or from your proposed side, what you notice is you create a very big circular feature here, where that line is cut in half. Kind of distracting. But again, I like that side if this were gone, for simplicity's sake. But again, what I notice about this side is, again, notice the base at that angle.
Yeah.
You gain, again, a lot of weakness, right? Because what you'll notice about this trunk is it's very thick in these two directions. And then in this direction, it's kind of, the trunk shape is like this. It's not round, right? So depending on where we view it, the trunk the lower trunk shape changes quite a lot. And so when considering like there might be some nice branch lines, some nice trunks, a nice viewing angle, but what features are making not so good a tree or a slightly better tree, right? So again, when I look at this side, I love the branch work, like you noted, but when it comes down to this, when you have so much complexity to sort of hold, I want to have the most grounding feature I possibly can on showcase in order to justify the branch
It
movement.
definitely becomes a bit of a tricky gamble with
Yeah, it's a gamble.
where they
Yeah.
grow thin and
Yeah, it's a compromise, you know, and yeah,
There is considerable difference too in the ovality.
there is, yeah, because it is oval, yeah. And you'll encounter this with any linear vascular tree, you know, very common with junipers. And that's why if it was more undulatory, if the live veins moved a lot more, like it was very whimsical, imagine these vines, it's kind of like a vine, but the veins moved around the tree a lot more beautifully, I would be absolutely okay with weakness in the base, because now it's this expressive feature. And really old junipers, collected junipers, you'll see heaps of reverse taper throughout the tree, right? Because it's so undulatory, it's so random. That is the beautiful thing of the tree. This tree is quite subtle in how its trunk shape alters based on that live vein structure. And so when I have such a subtle change, I don't want to go in and make the narrower space my emphasis when the rest of the tree doesn't do that. The rest of the tree is actually quite cylindrical, right? So I want to try, I think I want for the stability of the tree and the power of the tree, I want to make sure I show the wider space, right? And I guess what I'm describing, it's not always the case. It really depends on what the features of the tree have to offer. But in this case, definitely let's go down the classic route of bigger space, right? For the sake of the stability to hold what is quite a grand, large, long tree. Does that make sense? Yeah. But I do think your choice is interesting, particularly if the structures were reduced, right? There's a lot of interest there. Because one way you could change the sense of taper is if this trunk were removed, right? If we just tore this whole trunk off, see how that's creating a lot of mass here? It would totally alter the relationship of trunk to branch lines, right? I don't want to do that. It feels like a waste for something that is quite beautiful. But that would be one way around it. Now, from this side, which I think was the other side you're sort of thinking about, we have a wide base, right? Actually, probably the most widest, powerful base on the whole tree. Unfortunately, the branch lines are not as captivating, right? They're extremely towards you, right? Too much, right? Even for my liking.
I feel like you need to see that branch is coming towards you.
Yeah, you'd need to eliminate that or alter it in some way quite massively. So I don't think that's worth that reduction in work that maybe actually lowers the quality of the tree. So I think I want to lock into where I was originally going to work from and explore that. So I think I'm going to start working on the structure of this line here, being the longest line, the one that's going to define the greatest amount of movement within the tree. I'm going to lock in the structures there. Then I'll probably move over to the far left side of the tree, then the back side, then the apex. There's not too much to work. It looks like there's a lot on it, but when you break down the certain sections of the tree, there's probably a dozen structural branches, I'd say, right? So it won't be too much work to wire them, let's say, but the work is really going to be in how they get formed, right? So I'm going to start playing with that. So I'll hand it over to Evan if he's got something to say, and I'll get stuck into that work.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for that, Hugh. So while Hugh's been chatting up a storm over there, we've been making some good headway on styling this tree up. So similar to what Hugh was talking about with deadwood, I think you probably did the same for Kunzeas, but Kunzeas and junipers sort of have a very particular order of work. That just makes sense stylistically because the deadwood elements are so strong, it's usually better to do those in the initial stages prior to wiring. So with that in mind, what I've done on this juniper at least is we've created a bit of gin and a little bit of shari on the front, which probably, please come up a bit later and see that in the end. And then after we've sort of decided where that is, we're actually starting to wire out the branches now. So this order of work I typically always follow in a juniper. I'll do deadwood first, shari creation, branch elimination, and then styling of the tree itself. So aside from that, at the moment, what we've also started doing is just wiring some of the branching. So I've got Garland to work here, wiring the stuff in the top. And typically for junipers, a lot of the foliage actually comes down from the top and ends up as the branching throughout the tree. So what Garland's doing now essentially is bringing that branching that's coming up, the thin stuff, bringing it down and then placing it into a foliar pad. So particularly on junipers, a lot of the heavier branches are obviously difficult to bend down to get that nice angle that sort of sweeps and then flattens out to form the pad. So what we've done is eliminate a lot of heavier growth and actually replaced it with thinner growth. So for the time being, it looks a bit strange. So obviously the tree looks a little bit more juvenile, but long-term development-wise, that juvenile growth is much better to build better structure, because obviously a juvenile branch can shoot more readily than, say, a old mature branch. So with that in mind, it means we can develop some branching in sort of the gaps that we have in the apex and quickly fill that in with foliage. So adjacent to doing that, I've been working on this tail here. So obviously the decision to keep both of those little trunks that are splitting off means that stylistically it's got some very uniform parallel lines that don't particularly look interesting. So what I've done is put some heavy wire on the upper one, and I've started to try and bend it back and then forth, so then I can sort of fill the space above the main trunk or the main cascading trunk without blocking any of the trunk. So some of this branching I do want to come across and get very close to the trunk, but I really want a defined line on the underside, so I don't want anything really interrupting that. Maybe some things just infringe on it, but just a nice sweeping line that comes down for that large, thick branch. The other issue with parallel lines is obviously we have a quite distinct straight space in the middle. So to fill that, I've decided to actually keep some of the upper. So there's that big trunk that was coming down that sort of originated from the upper trunk. We've eliminated the large section. I've actually kept a smaller section there to fill the gap. So one thing with particularly Japanese classical bonsai design, you're using back branches to fill space in between the other branches most of the time. You try your best that you can to minimize that space within the branches, but yeah, that space will still exist. That negative space there is often too large to be good negative space. So by bringing a branch from the back, you do two things. You fill the space, but you also create the depth in the tree. So yeah, it's really about how we can create the depth so that while there is quite a large space here, it's a filled space that visually looks interesting. So aside from that, again, I'm very quickly just cutting things. I'll probably leave that tail, the main tail, until last, because everything else, sort of, where everything else is placed will depend how long I end up keeping that tail. So the length that we have at the moment, while it is impressive growth-wise, from a design perspective, it's probably not as long. It's much longer than I require for a good tree. So realistically, I might shorten this quite a fair whack back, but I'll leave that till last until I've placed everything else. So like any tree, I sort of start at the bottom and work your way up. In the case of cascade, start at the top and work your way down until you get to the end. Any questions at this point from anyone in the audience? No questions is good. So yeah, I'll just keep continuing my work on this and maybe just talk through what I'm doing while I do that. So obviously I put some main wire here, thick wire on this main sort of branch section and put a bit of movement in it. The next step is I'm going to start putting some fine wire and actually start to place the foliage pad. So particularly on junipers, when foliage is descending down, usually you have little pads of growth that are regularly spaced all the way down, just filling space. Traditionally in bonsai design, if you've learnt in the, like I say, Japanese Western fashion of having a first branch, a second branch, a third branch, that doesn't work at all for this sort of design. Really, I'm creating pads where I think there is space that needs to be filled, and then just moving my way down to the next bit of space and trying to fill it with more foliage. So there's not any sort of first, second, third methodology here. It's just about placing things, making them look good, going to the next bit of space, placing things, making those look good. But this is very tedious work. So to fully wire this tree out, I'd need the whole day like Hugh currently has. We've got time pressure of 2 hours, so I'm only going to wire the main stuff, the most important stuff that does need moving. I can't wire everything in that sort of time frame, so grab some wire and get started. Yeah, so one important thing with bonsai, I think, and Hugh's mentioned it a bit, where demonstrations like this aren't representative of how much time it actually takes to work on a tree. They're very quick. These are essentially a show for everyone to enjoy. But the realistic thing is to properly work on trees, and particularly some of the trees you would have seen in the exhibition can take days, if not weeks sometimes. So a tree like this, I'd probably estimate to fully wire out, I need a good 10-15 hours. Just to do all that fine, because fine wiring is very tedious, it just takes time. But yeah, to give this tree justice, you do need a straight 10 hours to actually sit down and wire it. But 2 hours, hopefully with the two of us that equals 4 hours, although I've been blabbing for about half an hour, so yeah, we'll see where we get to. We'll get to a relatively finished image, but it's not going to be the final result. This tree still needs a lot more wiring to get it to the next stage. Cool. Any questions at this point? Nothing? Okay, all good. Well, let's shut my mic off. Do you want to take over again, chatting
Sure,
Hugh?
sure. Yeah. Well, I'll start with, is there any questions thus far, guys?
So Hugh,
Yep.
I know you touched on in your podcast about basically breaking Kunzea branches to get them to reheal. I thought that was a really good point. People would have heard that.
Yeah, gotcha. So, huge disclaimer on that. Don't go around just snapping your Kunzeas to bend them, right, intentionally. But February, March into April, I find I think of it as the styling season in general for a lot of species, but very much in particular for what I'd categorize as a small leaf, broadleaf tree, Kunzea being as such. I then think of them in terms of a running small leaf, but we won't go there because it doesn't really matter to this discussion. But I generally like to categorize trees, so I have a repertoire of technique to think about. But February, March, absolutely amazing time to do heavy styling work on Kunzea. You can almost sever a branch off 80%. If you put some budding tape on it, a bit of cut paste, I would say 95% of the time it's going to survive, right? You do that other times of the year, it's dead, right? So most trees, when you hit close to the autumn equinox, right, which happened on Thursday, so happy autumn equinox to everyone, right? And why that's important, right? Some of you might say, oh, following the sun cycles is a bit woohoo, right? But what do trees do? Trees are sun worshippers, right? That's how they feed themselves, right? We get burnt, they get food, right? And so when you have trees getting towards that time of year where the daylight length, both in the day and the night, are quite equal, trees start to change what they're doing, right? And they've been doing it for a while, but they really start to ramp that up, which is thickening growth, growing vascular structures, growing roots, right? I have a Kunzea on my vendor's table out there right now. If you go to the back side of it, it's a rock slab, much like this. There's just red roots all over the back side of the root ball, right? And it's almost like clockwork. You get to this time of year and just roots start popping out of pots everywhere, out the drainage holes. Things start to thicken. You get lots of, on trees like Kunzeas, you get another flush of growth for the season, also as a part of that mentality. But it's an amazing time to go through and style trees, right? Because you can manipulate the tissue, you can alter it, you can damage it, and the tree will just continue to patch and keep going on with its life. So I reserve all of my heavy styling to do on really any tree. The heavier it is, the more I'll align it with this time of year, right? Except for maybe deciduous trees, right? Deciduous trees tend to do that a little bit later, more towards leaf drop time. It's pretty obvious with deciduous trees, they lose their leaves, right? That's when they're at their height of their vascular productivity, when they lose the leaf mass. But for your broadleaf evergreens, your conifers, junipers, so like right now for me, both these scopes of work, we couldn't have chosen a more perfect time to do it, right? If you had to choose one time of year, like what's the best time of year to do this work on a juniper and a Kunzea? Today, right? So this is very realistic scopes of work that both Evan and I are doing right now, from a timing perspective, very much so. But yeah, in terms of breaking them, you can, if you need to intentionally break some tissue, because it is so large and rigid, in order to release tension in the branch line. If you had to do that, now is a time to do that, right? I've done it on a number of Kunzea, both intentionally and unintentionally at this time of year. And so long as it's this time of year, you can open the tissue up at least to 50% and have absolute success with doing so, right? So it's a really, really fun technique. And again, on junipers, you can do the same thing, right? There are techniques to open up the tissue in order to change its structure. Severing the vein down by 50%, for example, is another technique, right? On a juniper, though, if you break the tissue horizontally, it's not as successful as if you break it, right, along the line of the tissue, so vertically. And what I'm saying is with Kunzea, if you do have to break it horizontally, 50% absolutely fine at this time of year, so long as you post-care for it. Mist the foliage, wrap it in parafilm, cut liquid cut paste around the edges of that tissue. Just basically make sure, don't let oxygen get into that opened up branch line. So I'll wrap it very, very tightly with wax tape, right, paraffin wax tape, so that no oxygen's getting in, no oxygen's getting out, no water's getting in, no water's getting out, right? So it's basically you seal over that pipe so it continues to function as normal. I had a student come up and he wanted to learn this exact scope of work on some Kunzeas, and I had a really big collected piece, maybe a trunk about 3 times the size of this, but it's about, the raw material was about this big. You could put it in a landscape and it would look big, right? But a really challenging piece of material. I was gifted by another collector. He said, I don't know what you could do with this. I thought it was cool, but I have no idea. So I said, challenge accepted. And then I had a student who wanted to come over and learn this exact scope of work. How the hell do you make such a big tree into a bonsai? I said, well, we can fold it, compact it, And so he came over and we did the work. And there was one trunk that we bent. And we were close to where it needed to get to. We were bending, and then the whole trunk just went, and 2/3 just snapped, and then it just levered on itself. And it got to exactly where I was hoping it to get to. I was like, that's where we want it. And it kept going, it kept opening up. So we quickly got a bit of rebar, propped it up, wrapped it up, put some more wire on it to support it. He was sweating, freaking out, and he's like, oh, fuck, we just killed that branch. I was like, I think it's going to be okay. This is kind of not what I hoped for. It wasn't planned, but this is perfect because this will prove the point if it goes well, right? So we styled the whole tree out, did all the fine wiring, everything went well. Even that branch that was almost completely severed, I said to him, wire it out, don't worry, it's going to be fine. Anyway, the whole tree is pushing foliage like nothing ever happened, equally across the tree. The branches that weren't broken and the one that was broken. Now, unfortunately, because it is such a large structure and it is almost severed, it will take her a number of years for that to patch itself up so much that it's self-supporting. So we'll have to be supported for a while, but to me, it was like the last justification I needed to go, this theory rings true, right? Because this branch, I was also in the back of my mind, I was like, geez, I don't know. I think it will be fine, but I don't know.
So, Hugh, with that
Oh.
technique,
Sorry, we'll just jump up here.
I was just going to ask you how much climate impacts the timing of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think
About Oxford versus
yeah. I think when it comes to this time of year, timing isn't as much of a change of difference because the autumn equinox is the autumn equinox, which is the main signifier. But what would change is I think the warmer a climate you are in, the further that time period is extended around that time, right? So imagine time flaring out from the autumn equinox, right? Is the way I would probably think about it. But you might bump it later into the summer as opposed to earlier. So for me, early February, even late January, I'm pretty keen to do that kind of work. But maybe on the coast, you would wait for maybe late February as your starting point, But much of a muchness, I think. It's more of a daylight length thing that the trees are triggering towards, because it's not a heat thing, because we're at the hottest time of year in February and March, right? In terms of peak hot days that we get and sort of the residual summerness of the atmosphere, it's a hot time, right? And in for Kunzea love the heat, right? They love to sunbake, right? They're all about it. So it's not necessarily the heat that's the issue, but it's getting that timing around that moment where the trees are like, let's go vascular, let's do all that work now. And so that's more what I'm sort of looking for, yeah. Yeah, so in Canberra, which I know you're from, Sandra, you're similar to my considerations in the mountains. There is a time where I want to stop doing that work pretty definitively because I don't want the tree to be so recently worked and then it freeze. Right, that's a major issue that you have to think about that Central Coastians do not have to think about. Canberra has to think about it even more than me. Blue Mountains, although it has a reputation of being cold, it's probably the least cool place that is distinguished as a cold place in the world, right? It's very mild for a cold place, right? Hardly ever drops below freezing, which kind of shocks a lot of people. Canberra gets -8, -10 pretty regularly. I think the record in my area is -4 ever of all time back in the 70s, you know. So Canberra very much has to think about that a lot more. So I'd say like late February, early March is your ending time to get that work done because that gives the tree enough time to patch itself up, put out growth, unless you can protect it. Then you're all good, right? So that's where a greenhouse comes in handy. That extends your season by 100%, right? Now there's no day that you don't have to worry about, yeah. So that's the caveat there. But if you can't protect, then yes, I'd say late February is you got a shorter window, yeah. So yeah, question over here.
I was just going to ask, with the breaking technique, would you ever consider using that to do something like a raft style?
In terms of like, what do you mean by that exactly?
Getting it to break and then laying the top of the tree down to the top.
Yeah. I mean, you could allow the tree to relax over. And it's a funny thing that you bring up, actually, because I've found with especially very lanky Kunzea that naturally have very little structural integrity, which happens, right? They might have a singular vein, deadwood, they're very thin. And I've had a tree that I've styled as a bunjin in the past, and it just literally relaxed over a course of 12 months until it hit the rim of the pot and then the bench. And it didn't break, but it relaxed into position. Raft forms, I think, are very true to form for Kunzea. You know, especially a clump raft. Imagine you get this tree and you just flop it over. Very true to form for a Kunzea because they tend to collapse in old age. Not die, but collapse. But yeah, if you needed to adjust a trunk line to break it and support it by laying it on a stone, you could do that. That would be a really interesting gesture towards the natural occurrences of the tree, yeah.
Yeah, I bring it up mostly because I see stuff like that.
Yeah, so often actually. And with Kunzea, it's a very common form. The collapsed, broken, but still alive form is very, very Kunzea, you know. So like opened up clumps, rafts, just vertical lines growing along the ground, you know, not as a rooted raft, but just as let's say a bunjin, but it's horizontal rather than vertical, right? Very, very Kunzea, yeah. In a way, what I'm styling here today on this tree is more of a medium-aged tree. I think an old, ancient Kunzea look is kind of maybe not the most interesting, right? I find it interesting, but the horizontal form is quite a challenging form to bring to the attention of a viewer, let's say, right? Vertical's a lot easier, right? That's why most trees you see in vertical forms rather than horizontal forms, right? Yeah, very interesting points. So you can see I'm just working through the structure, and like I said, this will take me the most effort, right? Because mechanically it's a bit more difficult, for one, but two, it's more considerate, because as you can see with this piece, you notice the changes that I've made in that form. See how I've just distributed the tips of the branches a little bit more spaciously, right? It's really what structure is all about. It's about finding the spaces, right? I use that line work to fill the spaces, right? So when I come down to do fine branch work, it all kind of just happens because I've already laid the branches in the appropriate positions, both with the wiring of the structure and the pruning, right? So I'll go in and do more pruning after the structural work as well to really lock all those things in. But see how I've just like created space? I've dropped a branch at the front here to fill this interior area. I rolled the whole trunk to distribute these pieces more openly. I pushed this piece back and then over to distribute these three pieces more openly, right? So that's really what it's all about. I do like to work this way, structure, then secondary, tertiary. It just makes sense, right? It limits the amount of failure or guesswork I'll actually have through branch construction. If I went through and just wired this whole tree out, I'd be going back in, cutting branches out, cutting wire. It would turn into a mess, right? It's different on simpler trees. I think a really simple tree that has very logical, easy to digest structure, you could just go through and wire it out and place it, right? Because it's all there. But this tree doesn't have a very, although it will become after this work, but currently it doesn't have the most logical structure. It's a bit harder to consume, and thus I need to go through and lay that structure out more acutely.
Well, I might take the opportunity to take over with some talking then. Yeah, so I think some of the stuff that Hugh was expounding about autumn work being very important for these two species, yeah, 100% agree with him. So for me, autumn is the time to do a lot of the heavier juniper work. So this time of year, I'll tend to do all of my deadwood and shari work. And it's the only time of year I do that sort of work. Same as repotting. I'll tend to actually, after doing bonsai for quite a while, I've learned autumn repotting is actually better than spring repotting for junipers. Just because the amount of foliar tissue that they're producing at this time of year is exponentially larger than what they'll produce during the whole entire growing season. Like we know for junipers, if you haven't heard before, but they get a lot of their strength from the foliage, being a sort of very high cold climate alpine tree. Often in nature they're sort of wedged between rocks, and sometimes the only source of water they're getting is the daily morning mist of the mountains, the clouds rolling through the mountains. So with that knowledge in the back of your mind, it makes sense that the time when they're pushing a lot of growth and the temperatures are starting to have those sorts of conditions means that it's the best time to do that hard work because they can recover quite quickly. So for me, when I'm working on trees, when I'm doing the difficult and when I'm pushing the tree hard and doing the hard work to it, I'm aiming for a point where it's about to start its sort of recovery period. So for things like maples, I'll do a lot of the work right at the beginning of spring because right before they're bursting out in their buds, you can do as much work as you want on, say, a trident maple. You can cut all the roots off effectively and regrow them with the knowledge that the tree is just about to push out new leaves and then put on a whole lot of energy in terms of root mass, foliar mass. And that's the same for junipers. At this time of year, the same as Kunzeas, they are pushing a lot of roots. We don't see much of it because obviously it's under the ground, but if you repot a tree this time of year, you could easily get maybe a quarter of its root mass back during that period for those 2 or 3 months before you hit the winter. So, but on top of that, one thing that we I think in Australia often forget to do is our fertilising regime and being on top of that and sort of using that as a tool to push our bonsai in the right direction. So, being a company man, working for Yates, fertiliser is in my blood now, and also in my nostrils and sort of all over my clothes. But the importance of autumn fertilising, I think, is lost on a lot of people still. This time of year really is the most important time to be fertilising your trees. Okay, any time is the most important time. The most important time should be now. Because trees are focusing energy on storage for a lot of trees that are going into winter hibernation. Because of that, their energy requirement is huge. You think things like deciduous trees, they're sort of developing a lot of girth on their trunk because they're starting to store a lot of sugars throughout their trunk systems. They're also, while they are losing leaves, through that process, they're consuming all the energy in that leaf before they're dropping it. They're purposefully killing those things off, taking that energy, bring it down into the vascular tissue. So it means that energy-wise and nutrition-wise, the trees are very hungry at this time of year because they're using all their energy to get ready for that 3 or 4 month stretch where they're doing nothing. They're not getting any new energy. So they need to build up their reserves prior to growing in the spring. And with that in mind, targeting what fertiliser you're using. So for trees to create a lot of vascular tissue, they're not using as much nitrogen, they're using more, say, potassium, phosphorus, other elements. So you should be trying to increase the amount of phosphorus and potassium you're giving to your trees at this time of year. Not for all species, obviously some of our phosphorus sensitive natives probably won't appreciate the extra phosphorus, but generally most trees, giving a good feed with I like to use flowering orchid specific fertilisers because they're quite low in nitrogen but quite high in P and K. Just making sure you're regularly feeding them at this time of year with those sorts of fertilisers. Because the tree needs all that energy, so to get a healthy tree in spring, you need to start feeding it in autumn effectively. And saying that with fertiliser, some species I don't stop fertilising throughout the winter even. So often it's sort of, I guess, common hearsay that trees don't really use fertiliser in the winter. A lot of people stop giving them fertiliser entirely. Something like this, which doesn't lose any leaves, so a lot of our evergreens will just keep all of that. Any part that's green on a tree is generating energy, so it needs nitrogen still. So for all of your evergreen trees, you just keep feeding them nitrogen even throughout the winter time. What I found, particularly on pines, if you do that, the moment spring comes around, they just explode in growth because they've had that whole season to develop bigger buds, develop bigger growing tips, and then the moment the sun and the weather is starting to tell them to grow, they can just sort of explode in growth. So fertilising for me is a big tool I'm using, not just for growing trees, but even for refining trees. So knowing when to give fertiliser is important when combined with technique. So a really good example is if you're pruning a tree for ramification to try and get smaller leaves, the last thing you want to be doing is giving it a lot of fertiliser right after doing that job, because the new growth will just come back strong, heavy, big. Knowing how to time your fertilising is probably a more important tool than actually doing the pruning itself. Some of my more refined trees at home, I was chatting with a few other bonsai guys, but it was a bit of a strange year, but even with that strange amount of growth it was having, I only pruned it once for things like Chinese elms, a very vigorous species, because the amount of fertiliser I was giving was enough to keep it healthy, but not enough to encourage it to grow large and big. So the virtues of fertiliser as a tool is something I could speak for another 2 hours about, but in the case of this juniper, I'll talk more about this, seeing as we're currently working on this one. So Garwin has nearly finished up wiring up the top. He's pretty much gone all the way to the apex, and we'll start to place some of that foliage even at this point, because the design up here is so far removed from the design down here that we can actually start to place everything up the top before we finalise everything else. While he's been doing that, I've been just working on this bit of growth here to get some wire onto it, start placing some branching, and then after that I'll start to tackle this one at the back here, probably put some wire on that and move it a little bit sort of towards and then out again to fill some gaps. And then I'll start to tackle this big one down here. So luckily the natural placement of whoever worked on this tree originally has done enough wiring and placement that I don't need to do as much wiring down the bottom. I can do primarily pruning and a little bit of structural wiring, but the structure is there already, so I'm not going to spend that much time wiring the bottom, but I'll focus more on this one because that's the one that really needs a lot of movement to get it into the design that I want exactly. So any questions at this point? No.
Just how long are you going to cascade?
Ask me that question in about half an hour. So it's more about how everything else up here looks before I decide that length. So at the moment, I'm thinking just a little bit shorter than where we currently are, but it's more about less about the length and more about sort of bringing the foliage in, thinning it out a little bit. So currently it's very wide, which for a tree, for a cascade, like in nature, if it was hanging off of a cliff, that's the last place you'd expect a very live, vigorous branch, because that branch is the one that's getting tousled in the wind, it's the one getting hit by the rain, the snow, the hail. So that one really shouldn't be as thick as it currently is. There'll be a lot of reduction this way and a bit of reduction that way. So cool. Any more questions at this point? I think that's about it. Oh, on there.
Would you consider cutting the longer branch off and restarting?
The thought did come through my mind when I was first looking at this tree. And part of me didn't want to, after really digesting it and sort of thinking about it, because it is such a strong character of the tree. Without it, I think the tree is still an average bonsai, but what makes it amazing is just that, two things, the length, the thickness, even the straightness I quite like of that branch. And it's more the angle that, the way it comes from the top and comes down, the bottom thicker section has a much more natural curve to it than the top. top one would, if you cut off that branch completely, it would sort of do this. It would go down, then it would come up, and then it would come down again. Yeah, that's not a very natural line, in my opinion. The more flowing natural line that comes up, down, flows through, you need that because that is the natural strength of the tree. It doesn't look contrived, it doesn't look man-made, it doesn't look artificial, it looks quite natural. So in my opinion, yeah, keep that branch. Cool, so sorry, I have to throw back to Hugh again, or maybe we'll have a little bit of silence for a bit. People can just get into their zen zone. But yeah, I'll keep working on this tree because I think we're about 50 minutes left, so I better hustle.
50 or 15? 50. Yeah. Yeah, so you can see I progressed the structure a bit. So I'll face the front towards you. So probably the main difference you're going to see, apart from, there's obvious differences, right? But between Evan's tree and my tree is, Kunzeas don't grow with the same kind of, let's say, sleekness that a juniper will, right? Different foliar construction forms. Junipers are a lot more sort of down and out, you might say. And Kunzeas are a bit more out and up, I'm going to say. Not up and out, because they tend to grow horizontally just as much as they will vertically in the branch structures. Unique like that, not quite the same as like a eucalyptus, right, which is very, very up and out. Kunzeas are a bit more, like, they sort of meander around quite a lot. The fine tip mass is exactly the same as a juniper. Almost any tree, the fine tip mass is the same. Whether it's a eucalypt, it's a juniper, it's a Kunzea, and everything in between, this doesn't really change, right, how that's formed, right? So it's really the structure and the secondary where we get the flavor of the species. And then there's obviously the nuance of how the foliage mass is presented based on the foliage form, right? Is it a radial leaf mass? Is it a flat leaf mass? But more or less, it's always going to be perky upright foliage mass. So I've had a bit of fun with the structure. This area has been kind of tricky to work out because this is kind of the counter to the very obvious movement to the right? So I don't want to stretch that side out because otherwise the tree will just feel like this, which will feel very young and kind of a bit silly. So I'm trying to compress it and create this sense of direction. So just notice how this back branch and the front branch, these two lowest pieces, I've taken them out, but then I've just directed them this way a little bit. So it just insinuates that direction towards the right, rather than having them stretched right out. So there's still a little bit to figure out within these two pieces, I think, but I'm feeling pretty good about both the back and the lower piece. This section I'm going to work on now, based on moving this branch here, notice how this branch here occupies this space, right? That's what's caused me to want to remove this. Very coarse branch, right? Had only foliage on the ends, on top of very coarse sort of boring branches, would be really tricky for me to use this. The only way to use it would be to go much taller and be in competition with our highest point here. So I figured I may as well just go back to the lower pieces, remove foliage from behind this area so as to not junk up the design with too much branch mass. And now I have space to flare these out, right? So as you go through the structural process, eliminations of further structures is a part of that process just as much as going through and wiring out those structures is too. But that's a lot of my methodology as you're working through branch lines. To create cleanliness in a design, if you have too many branches stacked in the one plane, that's where your designs start to look busy, full, over the top, right? And this becomes your methodology to be able to remove branching. Right? Why would I cut this out? It was because it's behind this. Now that I've moved that and I can see what's going on the rest of the tree, I know I don't need this because I'd have to move it elsewhere. I already have branches in that place elsewhere, right? So they're the kind of thought processes that I'm going through as I move this. And now that that's gone, I feel more inclined even to take this and push it further back into that space now because I have the room to do so, right? So the more you can open up your designs, the more rapid you can work through the tree and the more sophisticated I think the design will look in the end, right? Yeah.
There's a huge crop, very low branch there at the back that we're just working on. That tree has a lot of gin on it.
It does, yeah.
Do you think that detracts from the tree?
I think this is where, like, bonsai is kind of like wine, right?
Each to their own.
Each to their own, right? We all have our own tastes, but I guess when you're within that world, there's also there's dogmas around any given species. It's sort of like what I was talking about before. I'd never just chop a branch off of a Kunzea. At the very least, I would just tear it off, which you've been seeing me doing. I've been kind of just tearing some branches off. Because if I just cut clean, it's not really going to do anything. It's just going to exist as a clean cut branch. So when I think about any pieces of wood that have history or value to them, I'm going to leave them and use them as dead wood so as to tell the story of how the tree got here in the first place. So it is an acquired taste, especially if you're not used to it, seeing dead wood. It is an acquired taste for sure, but I think if you look at it as the storytelling component of the tree, you know, it represents what was, right? What's alive is what is. And as a tree ages, it's going to accumulate more and more dead wood. And Kunzea do that quite well because they have a very dry tissue, right? It holds for quite a long time on the tree. It stays pretty rigid for a long time. It's not the most long-lasting wood. It's not resin-filled, but it will last a long time, right? It will last decades, I would imagine, if it's looked after. And so it makes me think, okay, this isn't an ephemeral aspect of the tree. It's a very important part of the history. So for me to make what I think is quote-unquote the best Kunzea will have a vast amount of dead wood than one that doesn't. One that doesn't, I would probably personally value less than one that does, right? So, but it's obviously you've got to be within that world to appreciate that maybe, you know what I mean? But I think once it's told, it kind of makes sense, right? No, it's a really valid question, right? It's probably one of the most commonly asked questions that get asked about design is like, do I dead wood or do I not, right? Why would I or why would I not? But that's really a big part of the thought process is it a part of that tree's physiology to form deadwood? If it is, I would say that's a valuable feature of it, right? That's why you don't see extravagant deadwood features on pines, because pine, as you know, pine wood's kind of soft. It doesn't last a long time. Juniper wood is very hard, lasts a long time. So you see junipers have a lot more deadwood than pines naturally within classical bonsai, because it's representing the species at its best, right? If you were to take all the deadwood off of juniper, I think you would kind of make it very boring, right? If you imagine any really high-level juniper and you imagine rubbing out all the deadwood, it's just a really boring, twiggy tree, right? Deadwood is where it's at. So Kunzeas, again, have the same kind of feel and approach to me. But no, great question. All right, so I'm going to wire up this piece, and then I'll do the structure in the apex, and then it's just time to fiddle and make branches after that.
Well, I might take over just talking while Hugh gets back to wiring. So I guess there's one thing that Hugh's talked about a bit today, which is utilising species strength in our design. So I guess one misconception that often because of the way bonsai is taught in Australia, we tend to think that the Japanese styling is all this sort of codified style. You have your formal upright, you've got your formal in upright, you've got informal upright, cascading. And the issue is people think that this is the basis for design in Japan. They're sort of picking these styles and then they're getting the tree and then they're working on the tree. It's very much not the case. That's the opposite of how it's done. The way trees really are styled is similar to what Hugh's been talking about, where you identify the species, you sort of think about what the species' strengths or weaknesses are, you look at the material, you look at the material strengths or weaknesses, and then you start to design off of that. So generally, the Japanese aren't looking to cookie cutter the bonsai per se, and design it based on what the textbook has. They're taking this very much same approach. They're knowing it's a juniper, knowing how it grows, knowing how they're typically styled or maybe what features are the best, such as deadwood, and then identifying the good parts of the material. So it might be the deadwood is impressive and there's a certain flow in the deadwood which they'd like to mirror and sort of make the strong part of the design. And then, base their design around that. So they're not trying to force it to become a formal upright. It just happens to be a formal upright in the end because that's what the characteristic of the tree is telling the person styling it that it needs. So it's very much something that has resulted as a misunderstanding due to the way bonsai was first taught in the West. But from my experience in Japan, it's very much completely opposite to what a lot of people would imagine. And part of that is because a lot of the material is quite unique. You deal with a lot of collected material in Japan, similar to collected material that Hugh deals with, which you can't fit into these textbook designs. They don't magically have perfect number of branches or the perfect placement of branches. And they often have very unique features that just sometimes verge on ugly, but are unique enough that you have to work around it. So it means, the way I'm designing trees is pretty much the same way that he was talking about designing trees. There is no different approach between Japan and the West as to how we approach design. It's all the same. It's just some of the, I guess, older gatekeepers potentially of bonsai still think that's the way it's done because they've never actually been there and experienced how it's done in Japan. It's only what people have communicated in the past or developed for Westerners to learn bonsai through. But very much, the West and the East is aligned with how we approach bonsai design. Cool. So at the moment, I'll just talk about the tree. We're getting to the tail end of it, luckily, given the amount of time we had. And we're just getting to the final stages now of doing the wiring on, particularly apex, sort of, Garland's just doing the final touches, just doing some of these little tiny bits. And then once he's done with that, I'll start to place that area. Down here, I've pretty much finished this branch here. I'll just do a bit of quick work on this one. And then for the last 20 minutes, I'll deal with this big section down the bottom. So this bit should be relatively quick with the amount I'll cut off. But the process while I'm cutting it off is one where I'll have to actually sit and think about it for quite a bit and cut a section, rethink, cut another section, rethink. So I bet it should be good. So the tree, I think, is looking pretty good. It's much different to where we started this morning. You can see that I've really focused in on trying to clean up a lot of those lines. Because one of the challenges, particularly of this cascade, is we do have multiple cascading lines. But it's not an uncommon style for junipers like this, particularly older ones. It's common to have multiple cascading branches if they look tasteful, effectively. So that's hopefully what we've achieved with this today. Some of these branches here I'll still shorten a bit, but once I finish placing everything else. And for now, it's trying to figure out how to incorporate this section here. So one important thing with bonsai, I think particularly with junipers, a lot of people tend to face all of their foliage to the front, which looks good for a photo. The issue is you take 2 or 3 steps this way, and you can see all of those faults immediately. So it's very important to make sure your styling is quite multi-directional or 360 or 3-dimensional. So the idea is not having all your branches falling to the front, having branches that structurally make sense. They flow outwards. Doesn't matter if they're going backwards, they're flowing outwards from the point they originate from on the trunk. Because a bonsai front, while we do define a very distinct, this is the front, the viewing front is quite wide on a tree. Even more so if you have it in your garden, you'll look at the back probably as equally as you look at the front. So good foundational branch design means you should have a tree that really looks good from all sides, but looks best from this side. It's stupid to have it very contrived and unnatural when you just take a few steps that way. Because again, these are 3-dimensional things. We see so many photos online, on Facebook, in magazines, in videos that don't really represent bonsai well because they look amazing when you see them. I've seen plenty of trees like this in Europe, and they look amazing when you see the photos. They look quite bad in person. And that person, sometimes their reputation is built off their online following and all the photos they post. But when you see the tree in the flesh, you go, oh, this is really all show and smoke and mirrors with how they photographed it. It doesn't really have good design when you see it in person. The other issue with doing that sort of 360 design is you can imagine if you have all your foliage coming to the front and you want to prune it back, often there's not any foliage at the back to then potentially regrow and fill in that space. So it's about structuring branches down so we can get good sort of foliar pads and tips. But for me, junipers, the most important growth is actually the small inner growth up here on the branch, close to where the trunk and the branch sort of delineate. So that growth, in my opinion, is the most important because it's what becomes your future branching another 10 years from now. If you remove all of that growth here and the length of your branch gets too long, when you come to cut it back, you've got nothing and you're basically cutting off the whole branch. If you're keeping a lot of this small fine growth, So here's a good example on, let me just grab a branch from the bin. Maybe, yeah, this one's a good one. So, okay, this is us looking at the branch from top-down view. You can see here, all of this will be the edge of the pad, it'll be the outline of the tree. It's all of this growth in here that's more important, because if I remove this growth and come to cut this branch shorter, I physically can't, because there's no inner growth. If I leave some of this to get a bit stronger, actually fill in the design, then when I come to cut back in future, I can easily regrow a new branch from that point. Same again, in future after this grows back, if this has some small little bits of growth close to where it comes off the branch, I want to keep those, because it's always about how the future design of this tree is basically sustainable. So some people design unsustainable bonsai that can't easily be redesigned. Sustainable bonsai design is something that you can quite easily cut back to nothing, regrow the tree entirely in a matter of years, rather than spending 10, 15 years having to use other techniques to get branches back. So yeah, it's a big part of, particularly when styling a tree like this, making sure the foundations are really solid. There's no point styling it for a show to make it look good if I can't work on this tree quite easily over the course of 10, 15, 20, 50 years, hopefully. Yeah, so it's sustainable bonsai design that is just easy to work with is a priority when I design trees, more so than trying to make it look good at the same time. But for very raw stock, often it doesn't look good once you're finished. But in my head, I already have the vision of what it needs to be 4 or 5 years down the line. So, okay, not tooting my own horn here, but if you notice the second place tree in the open, the lovely white pine, that was the tree I've been working on for a number of years. When I first styled that tree, I wired out every single branch. Styled them all down. It looks amazing when you do that and you place all the branching. But in my head, when I'm working on that tree, while it looked good in the moment, my intention was for how it looks now 3 years down the track, once I remove all that wire and the branches start to grow up. Yeah.
Do you ever sketch the tree how you want it to be, say, with something on record?
No, I'm a terrible artist in terms of sketching. I can't draw for the life of me.
You can make a tree though.
What's that?
You can make a tree though.
Yeah, I can make a tree. So I'm a very visual artist in terms of, I imagine what it looks like in my head, but often it's a very cloudy design in my mind. I identify what the important bits are. I have the rough outline, but I don't have anything in detail in my head. Because when I find while I'm designing on the go as I do the wiring. So if I lock myself in too early, it might mean that my work order gets out of order because I'm so confident I can do this design. But you reach, say, the halfway point, and you realize, well, actually, now that I've removed that branch, I can't do that design. So for me, I keep a very cloudy image in my head of what I want the tree to look like. I work towards that goal quite methodically. Like I do, branch after branch after branch, bringing it slowly and close to the goal. And it's really through experience where I'm to a point now where I can usually hit what I visualize for the tree. Often, I've worked with Garwin on a number of things where we'll be working on a tree, the apex might be this tall, and I'll tell him we're going to get it this tall. And sometimes he doesn't believe me, but then I'm confident with the way I've noticed how the branches are structured that, I can get it down to that height. And often he says, wow, Evan, I don't know how you did that. And I said, well, it's easy once you understand the branch structures and how to wire, and all your technique is good. It allows you to basically meet your design quite easily.
With the pot, would you use a cascade pot on that, or a shallow bonsai pot?
No, I'm in the camp of I'm not a fan of those tall cascade pots. So typically for cascade, well, traditionally in Australia we have used those very tall square cascade pots. They're good for when you have the tree on show in your house, because obviously the cascade isn't hitting the ground. The issue is that they're too heavy in my opinion. For how thick this trunk is and how long this cascade is, to have a very tall, visually heavy mass at the bottom, it overpowers the tree. My preference would be a smaller square pot that's probably about this tall, about that wide, but display the tree on a very tall stand. So the elegantness and the space you get in the stand helps to remove some of the visual weight, and gives that feeling of the tree's grounded, but it's almost like it's floating in the mountains the way it comes down. So my preference is the much smaller little sort of cascade pot. You don't often use those square pots for anything other than cascades all the time. But yeah, for me, while it's hard to display at home then, you usually have to make a sort of custom stand or have done some milk crates in your garden. It makes more sense when you're displaying the tree. So all the time, I'm thinking about I want the tree to look its prime for an exhibition like this, because that's a really good goal. That's sort of the pinnacle of when the tree will look good, because the moment you hit that level of good, usually goes back down the other way for a bit, then you work again for the next exhibition. It's a much more natural rhythm for getting a tree to look good. Instead of trying to make it look good all the time, each time you reach a peak, you go down, but you reach a higher peak every single time as the tree develops.
And do you use a lot of mixing there because of the heaviness of your pot, like more light or thinner light?
So for junipers in particular, actually for the majority of my trees, and same as Hugh, we tend to use inorganic mixes. So something like a juniper, I'd be using a very pumice-heavy mix, maybe 60% pumice, sort of in a very small, fine grain, and then probably a bit of akadama for the other part, so maybe 40% of a fine, medium-sized grain akadama. That ratio of water to air is very important for junipers. If they don't have enough air to their roots, they usually don't survive very well. You tend to get a lot of health issues up top. They like water, they don't like having wet feet. So having a porous media that can drain very readily, but one that we can easily just reapply water to, and is more advantageous for juniper than something that retains a lot of water for a whole week. It's keeping it in that nice balance of 50-50 water to air in a good 24-hour period. If we can just keep reapplying water, it's much easier than trying to take water away from the soil. So,
that tree is going to develop something like that. How long before it goes to a bonsai?
I'd probably look at getting it into a bonsai pot after this styling. So I might even leave it, if this was my tree, I'd leave it for a few weeks, then try and repot it into a much smaller pot at this time of year. Only at this time of year though. Because like we said, the amount of foliage we've removed isn't detrimental to the tree. It's enough that it can still recover quite easily. But the time of year is the most important thing. This is the time of year that a juniper can recover without skipping a beat, through both the top and the bottom pruning. So if this was spring, I would say I'm on the fence. I'd probably leave it till next autumn and then repot it then. And any other time of year, I'd just say, no, just wait till autumn to repot. Because repotting is all about stress management. We've stressed the tree out a lot when we're doing two things, pruning and repotting. If we don't do one of them, that's half the amount of stress. And if we do it at the right time of year, that's the minimal amount of stress we apply. It's when we overstress a tree that we start to lose trees when we try and work them too hard. So, cool. So I might just get back to this. I know, without even having to ask him, Garwin has lovingly wired a few of the branches I was going to wire. But I'll do a little bit of bending now just to get those into position. It's a good thing about having an assistant. You can talk and do nothing, and he does all the work. So.
Will cost him dearly.
Okay, just remember that free paint I got you. Okay. So maybe throw back to Hugh if you've got more questions for him.
Lots of good points Evan just made there. Some of my favourite points too. Yeah. As well, it's nice about these kind of tandem demonstrators, so we can kind of wrap off each other, which is really, really fun. I think something that Evan pointed out, which I want to speak to, because it's very, very evident within these two trees, is I think, much like Evan was saying, I think the dialogue around, do you style your trees like a Japanese tree, or do you style your tree like, well, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. I don't think it, to me, is like good enough language necessarily anymore, in that I think what we're really talking about is species specificity. So bonsai is very much about the materials you're using, right? And what you'll notice, and I've been doing this with more and more with students lately, is sitting them down with a coffee, giving them a Kokofu 10 book, which is one of the better exhibitions in the world, definitely the prominent exhibition within Japan. So you can see some badass trees, for lack of a better term. And I challenge them to look through and go, find me a white pine, right? And I'll find all the white pines and look at them, and I go, take note of the details, take note of the way they've been styled, take note of the specifics, right? Now find all the black pines. Find all the black pines. Oh shit, they're really different, the way they've been handled, right? Now find all the Japanese maples. Completely different in the way they've been styled again, right? And what it helps you to realize, and I'll challenge all of you to do this, find the best imagery you can of classic bonsai or orthodox bonsai or Japanese bonsai, whatever you want to call it, right? And what you'll notice is different species are handled in different ways and have different aesthetic ideals, right? So what does this say about Japanese bonsai? It says that Japanese trees are styled like their corresponding species. It's nothing to do with Japan per se, that country in which they make bonsai look like. They're styling trees to look like the species that they are, right? And that's based to do with aesthetics. It's based to do with functional mechanics, right? Half the reason you style a tree to be like a certain way is so that it grows the best, right? Because different trees have different mechanics in order to hold their foliage form. Like a black pine, you'd never take the needles continually out horizontally. Where on a Kunzea, I'd be very happy to take that out horizontally because it holds that form absolutely fine. For a pine, it will want to raise itself back up. So you're working against the growth habit, right? So that's not conducive. But what you'll notice is Japanese trees are styled most of the time. There are outliers, there are mixing of forms for the sake of the exercise of it and the technique of it, and that's really interesting. You see trident maple styled a lot, like black pines, I would say, or white pines sometimes. Sometimes you see that. It's a real crossover. But they're just handling their species in ways which correspond to the way that those species form. So it's not about whether it's a Japanese tree or not, it's just about, is it a maple, is it a beech, is it a pine, right? So, I think when we come to Australia, I think our methodology, although the answers are right in front of us if you just pick up a book and look at the pictures, right? White pines are styled like white pines. Trident maples are styled like trident maples, right? So when I take a Kunzea, I'm not going to style it like a black pine. That would be very un-Japanese of me, right? If you think about it that way, right? I have to style a Kunzea like a Kunzea because that is what bonsai is in a certain sense. Right? It's really only, as Evan says, and I've never been to Japan, I've never been to Asia, in fact. So I can't say test to this in person, but I definitely have always studied lots of their work continually, right? Always have done. And so it's a reflection of their native species being represented in their way. So in Australia to take another species and want to style it like a white pine is kind of, to me, beside the point of what Japanese bonsai is even trying to do, right? Japanese bonsai is representational of their own environment using the species. So it comes down to material. A really obvious way to think about this is like, if I took some iron and I tried to put it on a clay wheel and form a pot, kind of the wrong material to do that with. Maybe I could if I turned it molten and used some radical heat-resistant tools to spin that pot out of molten iron on the pot, and it would look pretty cool, but it's not necessarily the material that best suits that process, right? So bonsai is the same. Like, if I take a Kunzea and I want it to look like the best white pine ever, it probably won't, right? It'll be really difficult. It won't even, and that's a really obvious example. It's kind of silly to say because it is so obvious, but that's sort of what I'm talking about here, right? And this is where that dogmatic approach of style everything like a pine, I think, comes from, is because we've thought about bonsai as one process, right? But really, it's one process. Like, I handle every tree the same. I jump into them in the same way. But there's fine details that make up the difference of the whole, right? Make up that species specificity, as opposed to, do I style it classic or not classic? I don't think is a discussion. Because if I have a black pine or I have a juniper squamata, I'm going to style it like a juniper squamata. I'm going to style it like a black pine. which will make it look Japanese, quote unquote, right? Because it is a species of that region. There's a certain way to handle them. So for me, it comes down to, it's less about what form am I trying to create, it comes down to the species I'm playing with, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. I think it's a much more interesting way to think about the discussion. And I think it's true. I think it's a true way to think about the discussion as well. I think where it gets a bit hazy, and why maybe for us in Australia it feels a little bit more harder to grasp, is because if we do look at our endemic environments, we don't have a lot of familiar species from a bonsai context. It's hard to look out into the landscape and go, oh, I feel like I see that in the bonsai form, right? Because a lot of our bonsai information comes from the Northern Hemisphere. That's why, like, I think when you see the European artists or the American artists, there's less, it's more of a one-for-one, because although predominantly, and not a lot of people realize this, but even in America, Europe especially, they predominantly use their native species, right? They use native trees all the time. Predominantly, I'd say, these days. But what you've got to remember is, although they're native species, they're all the same genuses that you'd find in Asia. Juniper, pine, oak, beech, maple, you know. So there might be native versions, but it's easy to glance over and go, oh, it's just a juniper, whatever. It's a juniper, you know. But not taking into account that a Juniper sabina has a very different form to a Juniperus chinensis from Japan. Has a very different form to a Rocky Mountain juniper from America. But they're all juniper, so it's easy to sort of categorize them as one. We're working on trees in Australia. The Southern Hemisphere has a pretty similar tree network across the whole Southern Hemisphere, but there's less, you definitely see a lot less information to consume from the Southern Hemisphere. But that's the comparative difference. Oh, it's changing, absolutely. I think that's what people like Evan and I are trying to do, you know, is add a little bit more information there. You know, to really sort of talk about what is different. Why does the Southern Hemisphere, not even Australia, just the Southern Hemisphere feel different? And it's just because it's a totally different part of the world, right? It acts differently. We have longer summers than the Northern Hemisphere. It changes the biology of species. Most of the Northern Hemisphere is Southern Hemisphere is further towards the equator than the Northern Hemisphere is relatively. Most of Europe, you know, Northern Asia, North America exists where our ocean between Australia and Antarctica exists equivalently. Right? The Southern Hemisphere almost has no land where the whole of the Northern Hemisphere is, relatively, you know what I mean? So we have our species are a lot more similar to like North African, right? Middle Eastern, very, very southern Italy, you know? Like Tasmania and Sicily are about the same latitude, right? In terms of their species. Yeah. Yeah, everyone thinks Tasmania is this arctically cold place, but it's basically southern Italy, right? Which we associate with a very hot place, you know. But Italy gets very cold for Australians, you know. Italians call it hot, but you know, it gets cold in the winter. But it's funny. Yeah, so I think bonsai is all about species specificity. So my recommendation is if you want to make from badass pines, get some pines, right? But it might be more tricky for you to make a badass pine-looking image of something else, right? But that's the magic of bonsai. That's where you can pick and choose what you're wanting to create and what you're wanting to do.
Because I've just spent the last weekend in Kosciuszko, but looking at the snow gums there, like the characteristics you get in those are very similar to what you see in, obviously more miniaturized, but say Yamadori junipers in the Northern Hemisphere. They're just scaled up massive, but those same alpine conditions, they're getting that same sort of snow blizzard. And because of that, they're just forming these same characteristics. All this amazing deadwood, these amazing live veins, but they just happen to be gums. So even when you scale down the foliar masses, they still look quite similar to how the junipers would be growing in Japan or Europe.
The main difference is being the way the foliage is presented in the end.
Yeah, that's it.
It's broadleaf, it's up rather than down and out, you know, like it would be on a juniper. But when you break it down like that, it's like kind of makes you realize that trees are just trees, right? It's really that fine detail at the end that really differentiates a species, which is inherent because if you're working with a snow gum, it's hard to make it not look like a snow gum because it has snow gum foliage, right? But it will have a very similar form to a juniper because the environments those two things are coming from are the same. It's just in Australia, that alpine environment is dominated by a gum tree, where in, say, North America, that alpine environment is dominated by a pine or a juniper species, right? Same environment, though. Right?
Yeah, then coming into the way we style our species, like the way we style a snow gum while it is up and out, the deadwood work is exactly the same, or quite similar to how we do conifers. So, very much, you can see me and Hugh are very much on the same page of the way we've approached design previously isn't a mystical art. It is all based on species, except for, say, and this is the one example where it's a bit different, where the way pines are traditionally styled in Japan, that is a cultural specific styling. Pines, if you see them in nature, they don't magically have these nice squat forms with branches. That form is based on niwaki, like garden trees, landscape trees, more than it is bonsai.
An accentuation of the species in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is, so it's to say, there is some cultural differences, but in Japan, it's really only pines that have that characteristic. All the other species are styled entirely how the species grow. One of my favourite examples is zelkovas, where you hardly ever see them as broom styles because the broom style is what is the best form that takes all of the lovely characteristics of the zelkova and just enhances them. Like the fact you can get that massive twiggy dome of bare foliage in the wintertime. Only a zelkova can do that, and I feel like it's lost if you don't have that style of just a massive branches that's twiggy growth that takes decades and decades to build. Other species don't have that characteristic. Same as their bark, or the way that the baris develop. But if you look at zelkovas in Japan, you'll often see them in that broad, deciduous form. So it's really that idea of form following tree function.
So a question for you, Evan. Would you say zelkova is more maybe a representation of the urban environment?
Not so much.
Like
I find
street tree kind of
it's
iconography, maybe?
A little bit. For me, it's more of that lowland temperate climate. Like they're very common in large. Say a zelkova form is representative of a zelkova that's grown in the field, maybe next to some rice paddies, that hasn't had to experience hardship. It's a form where it's allowed to grow to the sky and basically be as free as it wants without any restrictions, and that's the result. Is for a tree, physiology-wise, that canopy should just be big and dense because that's the tree capturing as much sun as it possibly can. The rounded shape, again, if the sun's coming up this way, ending over there, that rounded shape is just following the path of the sun. It doesn't make sense for one section to be out there and magically growing out much wider than the other section. If this is a tree in a large vacant field with nothing around it, it has no enemies that it has to fight for sun with, it has nothing pressure-wise, there is no snow that's laying down on the branches weighing them down, there's no blizzards, there's probably just a man tending to his crops next door to it. I would say it is partially urbanised, the form though, because that idea of a vacant field with rice paddies wouldn't exist without agriculture, effectively. The fact that humans have gone out, cleared a lot of trees, started to grow crops, and then for whatever reason they've just left that one tree. So I guess in a sense it is actually an urbanised form, but a rural form, not a. Because you'll see that form in, say, London plane trees throughout the city. But in the forest, they obviously wouldn't be growing that freely. There wouldn't be as much space around it. And seeing that as well, I guess another good example of, at least what I find in Japan, like a thing about functionality and form and beauty all aligning with each other is flowering trees in Japan. The way they do flowering trees really is the defining point of that style, type of styling. So one common thing, if you have something that has a very large flower, in Japan the branch placement and how high the branches are is based on how tall that flower gets. The idea is if the branches are too close, obviously the flower's just going to hit the branch above it, but if they're too far away, there's maybe a bit too much space. So often in the Kokufu Japanese exhibition books, you'll see things like magnolias that are just covered in flowers everywhere, but each flower has its space. It doesn't get infringed by any other any other flower, any other branch. It just has its own little space that it sits in. And that's entirely intentional. They'll purposefully wire the branch down all the way to the bud and place it with the knowledge that it's going to grow this big and grow that tall. Same for azaleas. So azaleas, people think they look very contrived and cookie cutter, but the way they're styled, they've got these very typical shapes with all these branches that have these regular spaces and just these flat pads that don't have any sort of definition to them. They're not designed for looking good when it's not in flower. They're entirely designed to look good when it is in flower. That large blank vacant space of foliage, when it's filled with flower buds, suddenly is a massive just flowers, nothing else. And then the space between them is so that the flowers can grow up to the height they need. I guess the last example for fruiting species, one of my favourite species in Japan is a persimmon. Just the amount of colour they get, the fact they lose all their leaves, retain their fruit, get this vibrant red to orange fruit that's usually speckled as well. When those usually are styled in the cascading style, the space between branches is dictated by how low the fruit hangs. It's a very small fruit, there'll just be a little tiny bit of space and maybe a massive fruit. If it's a full-size persimmon, often you'll see a very sparse tree that's designed to just highlight the bigness and the colour and having enough space between each branch so there's not fruit everywhere next to each other. It's nice and giving enough space to appreciate the season. So it's something that's been mistranslated through our bonsai education, at least in the latter half of the last century. But it's something that we're starting to see a change in. People are starting to pick up on this, either people who've been to Japan, people who've studied with some of the masters who are starting to push in that direction, such as Ryan Neal or Michael Hagedorn in the US. But again, a lot of these people are learning that technique and that styling method from Japan and then transplanting it to their own native species. So that's the big catch, is it translates easily because it's not designed around Japanese native species, it's designed around how you appreciate native species and approach them. So again, Hugh's pushing that probably in the, I guess Hugh and Jared, both of you, like probably the top in that sort of direction of design in the country and pushing us towards that new approach. It shows with Hugh's trees, most obviously. All of his trees, the functionality is fitting the form perfectly for those. Cool. Hope you like a little bit of a pat on the back. So.
I appreciate it.
How are we doing for time? Okay, so I think we're about 10 minutes before the break, so I might just switch off and get back to focusing on this tree. So I'm not very good at talk. Okay, I can talk while I style, but I don't like to because I use my arms a lot. So.
It's funny demonstrating because we are trying to entertain, aren't we? As much as do work, It's kind of, the demonstration model is interesting because I would say there's a lot more people who could be on this stage doing really phenomenal work, but they might not be a good public speaker, Yeah. So I think there's a lot of room for having maybe sessions like this or in tandem where people are just working, they're just silently working. It would be really interesting. Because I think for you guys, let's throw it back on you guys, right? What can you guys do in these kind of sessions, right? Because these are fantastic opportunities to learn. Get amongst it, get as close as you can. When the break finishes, I want all of you to come up and get a good close goggle on these trees and see what we've been doing in the detail. Do that, because you'll learn a lot just by looking. You don't even have to ask a question. Do so if you want to, but just have a look. Really think about what's been going on, what's happening, what's been made, what's been done. Try and digest that.
Yeah, I think don't be afraid to also tell us if you think we're wrong. Because good
call us out.
The thing is, me and Hugh, we discuss this sometimes when we do get together, but to have this sort of discussion on a stage is not common, where we're able to sort of just spit out our ideas, sort of bounce off each other, talk about them. Really, without these discussions, I don't think bonsai progresses at the pace that it should be progressing in Australia.
Can I just interrupt? Can I Scott Armstrong?
Oh, no worries. So is there Scott Armstrong in the room at all? We have a Scott Armstrong? Oh, there we go.
Yes.
I lost one of the branch.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, I'll bring it to you.
You've got one piece still dropping straight down. Is it because...
That one?
No, underneath that.
Oh, this one?
Yeah, Are you going to do with something with that? Because to my eye, when your front comes towards me, it's a distraction.
Yeah, so very simple answer.
Is that there for a reason, or are you going to do something with that?
I have to wire it. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
You did everything
That was the
above it.
easiest question to answer. That was great, thank you. No, so
Everything above it, and then left
Yeah.
that there, and I thought,
Yeah.
why?
So this is a great to just sort of highlight what's been done thus far, and just to re-articulate that. So first stage, which took me most of this session, right, was setting all of the structural branches.
Yeah.
So notice how I only wired the branching that comes from the trunk line, right? So I wasn't concerned, I'm not thinking about the fluff, the foliage at all. I'm just concerned with setting the line, right? So I think for me at least, and I find this rings true for a lot of people, especially when they learn this model, if you break your tree down into stages, don't worry about the rest, right? It's so easy to get tied up in this tip when you're trying to set that. This has nothing to do with that, right? Working structure, secondary, tertiary, and so on, you're dealing with less and less important branches, right? In a way, this is important. This is the life source of the tree. But from a structural point of view, it's super ephemeral, right? It's gone, right? It's such an ephemeral piece of the design. So working on the structure, and you can see the difference, and this is what's going to happen over this tree. Now I'm going to go, right? And the whole thing is going to be a wave of change as I go through and detail it out. And notice the change. See how I've taken all that foliage, the secondary lines. A lot of the tertiary lines on Kunzea, if you are savvy with how you play with the secondary lines, you can get away with almost wiring no tertiaries. This is something I've developed over time. It takes a bit of time to get used to that process, so I'm almost placing tertiary branches with the preceding secondary wire, right? How I place that branch aligns my tertiaries in the right spots. So then I only have to go through and one or two of the tertiaries that maybe don't fit into that, I bring into place. Minimizes the amount of wiring I can do and increases the pace across the tree, right? My goal is to work on as many trees as I can in this short life. So I don't want to be worrying about fiddling with fine branches if I can help it, right? But what you're going to notice is a change now in the foliage mass. So I'm almost painting in around the structures that I've set. Structure being the bone works of the tree. Right? It's where the value is. And then the tertiary branching, the secondary and tertiary branching will be how I create interesting flow, form, complication around the structures. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah, so it's all process driven. So this piece, I'm probably gonna take these tips and drop down again, and then come back up and out to have this kind of sweeping sort of rhythm. Kunzea are very rhythmic. If you see big, large ones in the landscape, often you'll see the biggest ones sort of more towards the coastlines. They often are very directional, not windswept. They're not like this, but they're directional, right? But they're very voluminous, right? Lots of spatial feeling, lots of sort of weird branch lines that sort of pick up and flutter. Very fluttery trees. I imagine them like a kite flying in the wind, right? But they always finish off with very sleek, beautiful foliage, very juniper-like, the way their foliage masses all come together in a sense. But the value in Kunzea, and every tree, but very much how you get that feeling, it's not here, it's in this, is where you get that feeling of it being Kunzea, or whatever I want to represent. So that's why this is the most important. And then what I do with this highlights that, right? Is it more this, or is it more this? But that stays the same, yeah. Yeah, so by the end of, I'll let Evan really emphasize the end of the session, because I'm going to stay here. I'm not going anywhere. So while he's like sort of finishing up with what he's doing there, I'll try and get this area finished. So any of you that do have to leave, you at least get to see like what's going on with the tree, right? Once you see this, you sort of get an idea what's going to happen throughout the rest, right? Just maybe not the totality of it all, which will be quite interesting. Before I jump back to Evan, because I see he's speeding away there working, any other questions for me? All good?
Good. Yeah, cool. So I'll just take over while we're just on the finish line now. So yeah, we've effectively, I think, pretty much finished this tree in terms of doing the rough styling, so the initial rough styling. All I've managed to do is place pretty much all of the main and even secondary branching on this. But yeah, just to highlight, I wouldn't have been able to do this if I didn't have Garwin here helping me, who's probably done more wiring than I have, although I've done more talking. But yeah, this is just setting up the bones for the tree. So some of the branch length and some of the density of the foliage will look a bit strange because I need to leave a bit more for the tree to get sort of recover and be healthy. So again, it doesn't look like a final finished image, and there'll probably be some little fine twigs that are sort of out of place, but it gives us a good building point to start, yeah, really developing this tree even further. Just in this canopy here, I'm just roughly placed, so yeah, there'll be a bit of a bald spot in the middle, which is quite typical when you're doing conifers, because yeah, areas like this are usually the most vigorous and they'll just fire away with new buds quite easily. So as a result of that, it means there is a bit of a bald spot at the top of the tree, but with the idea that this is nowhere close to being finished, this is only partially on the way to being finished. But most of the lines actually, sorry, now that I see it now, I might readjust the one at the back a bit more. But yeah, I'm quite happy with how most of the lines have turned out for this cascading section. So I've tried to, again, use all three lines in terms of those three cascading branches that are coming down. The issue is one of them does come from the top part. It doesn't actually come from that same place as the base two trunks that are flowing down. So I'm aiming to actually try and hide some of that section with foliage in future. So at the moment it's a bit sparse and you can actually see through to it. But in the future I'd like to bring a branch in front of it that just hides the fact that it does that. So part of that is to add a little bit of mystery to the trunk, but also to remove some of the ugliness from the fact that it does come and cut across and there's a bit of space in there. So yeah, just bear with me while I just actually move some of these lower back branches to hide that gap a little bit. So yeah, one of the challenges with a tree this big and wide is I do have to keep going back and forth, particularly when I'm trying to place the back branching. But yeah, with in mind that the back branching is there to fill some of the space. So once we're done, we'll flip this tree around, but there is this quite large, I don't even know what to describe it, dignity space shaped, if you've seen The Simpsons, that's in the middle. It almost looks like a chicken nugget in its form. But I'm trying to fill that so it isn't so obvious that it's a big chicken nugget base. But it's a bit of a weird blob, so chicken nugget's probably the closest I'll get. McDonald's one for reference. But yeah, and we'll talk about the tail at the end here. So I have pruned it back quite a bit. Garwin's just doing a little bit of final wiring, and I'll do a little bit of placing just to make sure they're in the right position. The length I did end up removing with some of the heavier branching down the end and cutting back to that thinner branching. So effectively the thinner branching, typically on junipers, that's the one I'm using to develop a tree. Thick branches are hard to move. You don't get that nice bifurcation or the going from thick to thin in terms of the taper of branches. So it's much easier to design and to place pads using thinner branches because you can build much greater density with less visual mass. So that is the mass is then contained in the foliage as opposed to the branching, because yeah, what it often looks quite funny on junipers is if you've got a really thick section of branch and then the foliage is just built off of that. So for me, I don't want the foliage to be directly on the thick branch. I want it to flow off of the branch and then develop maybe somewhere out here. So yeah, it's just about removing some of that thickness, getting the thin ones. I'll give Garwin another few seconds to finish his wiring and I'll start placing. Okay, all good. So yeah, now it's about how do I form some nice foliage pads. So down the bottom, so on junipers I'll typically start with smaller little units of pads up the top, and as I work my way down, those units get larger and larger, and maybe more complicated in terms of one little thick branch section might split into three, but they're all sort of contained close to each other. So if you give me another 3 minutes, I'm just going to place this very quickly, and then yeah, we can get to the end of the demo and start talking through. Yeah. Cool, no worries. Okay.
One thing to sort of notice about both Evan and I's projects here too is notice how we're kind of like using the trees in their entirety in a way. I think it's very easy to sort of get a bit lazy and I'll just cut it off and I'll do it again later, you know. Very, very, very easy. But you know, I think understanding that bonsai does take time, and the best tree that you can do some. Trust me, you can do some very profound stuff that you might look at a tree in a photograph or in a show or anywhere, and you might go, God, how do I do that, right? A lot of it's skill, a lot of it's time, right? Just investing that time and energy into a piece, but like, you know, good trees often are, if you look at the framework underneath, if you really, really digest what's going on there, there's a lot of complication, right? Keeping as many of the complicated structures as you can as possible, utilizing the most amount of the tree possible, leads you to have a much more interesting form at the end of the day, right? So it's one of those classic design tropes where, you know, if it looks really simple and beautiful and elegant and like nothing ever happened, a lot has gone into that, right? If it looks like it's really been like thrashed to 11 and it's like, it looks worked, probably didn't have as much work put into it, right? It's kind of ironic, right? It's that elegance, that sense of like, it was always there. That is really where the effort is in there. And take note, look around the exhibit and think about what trees you really like. And note the complication, although you are feeling like it's so simple and elegant and easy looking to look at and digest. Evan's done a great job here really utilizing the tree to its max. Doesn't mean that's the form we'll always have, but at least today, it's taken it to a place that's going to allow it to progress and perpetuate. So really, really good work there on his half.
No, thanks for that, Hugh. So I think a really good, so I did some of the judging for the club section yesterday, and there's a really nice tree I like, but it's a very subtle tree. So I think it got first prize in the platinum category. Is that? Okay. Yeah, so if keep an eye out for that one, because for me it's a very subtle tree. It's not loud at all, but it was the best in that whole section in my opinion, because knowing the work that'd gone in to achieve that subtleness, or even, I guess in Japanese aesthetic, it's really that wabi-sabi. You hear that term thrown around a lot. Well-intentioned wabi-sabi is the most difficult thing to achieve in bonsai. But with wabi-sabi, when you've got it, and it's just amazing. If you don't have it, then usually it's hard to find it until you just sort of come across it. So, to find a tree that's powerful like that, for me, a lot of people probably would look at the juniper next to it and go, oh, how come that didn't win? It's because it mastered that very subtle art that's, like Hugh said, you often look at, but you actually don't realize that all the balance and the harmony that you see is intentioned. Cool, so I just want to have a quick look before I spin this around for everyone. Yeah, I think it's pretty good. Okay, so we'll spin this around just a bit. Maybe going to move it this way a little. And like Hugh was talking about utilising all of the material, that's very much the way I design. I don't like to cut off things unnecessarily. If there's interesting features that, while they look a little bit ugly but are unique enough, I'll try and actually use those and make them less ugly, make them more harmonious with design. So so you can see that I've actually utilised, and a lot of people probably wouldn't do that. They'd utilise just that one cascading trunk and leave it at that. What I find is, if you do that, you lose all the balance in the tree. For me, a good tree is one that's effortlessly balanced. You look at it and you sort of just feel zen. You don't feel... So I guess, contrary to some of the other styles, which are a bit more tension and conflict, Japanese style is very much based in having balance, harmony, for more traditional classical trees. You still do see tension in some of the Bunjin or literati stuff. But for me, a good tree, you should just sort of feel at ease when you look at it. There's no to and fro, even though there's big elements that maybe flow down and do very dramatic things, there's other things that balance and offset that design. So for me, yeah, I think I've reached a good level of balance with this, particularly using those 3 trunks. And like I mentioned at the top, where without keeping those other 2 trunks, I think the tree would feel very empty. You get this very long stretch of nothingness, which isn't what Japanese bonsai design is about. It's all about having fullness, life, filling space with foliage, having quite a full look, but one that can feel sparse in the places where you need it to feel sparse. So this tree is incredibly full. My intention onwards for the design is the top will probably just be all foliage, with pads that are defined by really minimal space between each pad. Coming down to this section, you will get a few spaces here and there, but a lot of this foliage will also be quite full. So the intention is less space, but more ideated and sort of pinpointed space. And that's, really the key to my design is filling the space and just picking the spaces that you want to highlight. So for me, the big highlight is the space below this. I've framed it, so rather than leaving the open space of that descending branch, I've framed it a bit with this back branch. So I find putting things behind things you want to highlight actually does a better job than leaving space behind things you want to highlight, because having the depth there is important. Having the element in the back enhances the front rather than makes it more confusing. It's bringing in harmony. So yeah, I think that's probably about it. Any questions before we finish up for today about the design or anything? No. Oh, good. Okay. Well,
what can I just say? A huge thank you to Evan and Garwin for
big thanks to Alan as well.
That was a lot of work on that tree. So that's very impressive, and that seemed to work well. Like the two demonstrators side by side.
Yeah, that worked. Yeah, amazing.
You fed off each other.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I think it was great.
It was great.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that.
Or at least me and Hugh. It's good pairing us up. Maybe others, maybe not so much.
So Andrew Edge is going to auction this tree.
Yep, we're going to have an auction in a sec. So feel free to come up and have a bit of a look at the tree, especially if you are interested in the trees. Obviously turned out a magnificent specimen, so it'll be an asset to anyone's garden if you decide to purchase it. So take a minute, come up and have a look if you want to.
Just going to get a quick photo of these two.
Sorry.